Hello YouTube, thank you for clicking on this video and shout out to Big Daddy Algorithm for pimping it out to you. My name is Megan and welcome to my channel. So a couple of weeks ago, an article was published in the Times about Ballerina Farm, a popular Tradwife account with a following of 9.3 million on Instagram and 8.7 million on TikTok as of filming this video. For those of you who don't know, Ballerina Farm is run by Hannah Nealman, a 34-year-old Tradwife influencer who posts wholesome homesteading content that features her 8 kids, all-American husband Daniel, and their sprawling 328-acre farm in rural Utah. Her content is wildly popular, and she's followed by famous actresses like Jennifer Garner and Hilary Duff, to which all I have to say is, why, Hilary, why? You were such an icon. Like, what happened to you? Anyways, that wasn't very feminist of me, but still, if you're a millennial and you grew up with Lizzie McGuire, you feel my pain. I know you do. Anyway, this article was explosive and the discourse online about it has been wild, so obviously I had to chime in because this is essentially a feminist issue and I have strong opinions about it. Surprise, surprise. Hannah's been dubbed the queen of the Tradwives, and she was a polarizing figure even before this article came out. She's both been heavily criticized for showcasing an unrealistic and anti-feminist domestic fantasy on her social media accounts, as well as passionately defended for making a choice to live the way she does. And isn't that what feminism is all about? The freedom to choose what kind of life you want to have? So this idea of choice feminism is what I want us to examine today. In this video, we'll be going through the entire article, looking at it through the lens of choice feminism and asking ourselves what it actually means to choose something in conservative religious circles. We'll also be looking at the idea of choice feminism through the lens of intersectionality and unpacking this whole idea of choice in the first place. This is something that I've been wanting to talk about for a while on this channel, and this article just kind of provided like a handy, timely platform for me to do so. So we're going to use that as kind of a jumping off point to get into what choice feminism actually means and why it's so popular, and also why it's so problematic. You didn't think we were going to talk about something without poking holes in it, did you? Before I get into it though, don't forget to like and subscribe. The channel's been growing pretty steadily and I have all of you to thank for that. For those of you who are new here, I upload video essays 1 to 2 times a month, roughly speaking, on topics that have to do with feminism, LGBTQIA+ issues, and identities, as well as fashion and history, all through a queer feminist lens. So if that's your jam, then I invite you to join the party and stick around. Okay, now that the obligatory channel plug is done, let's actually get into it. Choice feminism. I get a lot of comments on my videos along the lines of, if a woman is happy being a stay-at-home mom, we should leave her alone and not criticize her choice, and feminists are always telling women what to do, and that's hypocrisy because true feminism is celebrating women's choices, and so on and so on. This is choice feminism. Choice feminism is the idea that any action or decision that a woman makes is inherently a feminist act because a woman chose it for herself. It's a very mainstream idea, and it's the one that underpins a lot of pop feminism and pinkwashing. It's catchy because it essentially means nothing. If wearing makeup is a feminist act because a woman chooses it, then not wearing makeup is also a feminist act because another woman chooses that instead. So then what does choice even mean if there are no negative consequences to choosing one thing over another? One of the biggest problems with choice feminism is that it assumes that women exist in a vacuum without being influenced by things like passive misogyny, capitalism, culture, and religion. It ignores intersectionality and implies that the solution to sexism lies in our personal choices. It's a very capitalist, very neoliberal idea, which is why it lends itself so well to pinkwashing and to fourth wave boss babe 2010s era pop feminism. The idea of personal choice is a very capitalist neoliberal one, and it sets up freedom as being nothing more and nothing less than simply having the ability to make choices for yourself and not have those choices be brought under fire. At first glance, this seems great. Being empowered as a woman to make choices for yourself is literally the definition of freedom, right? The problem with this, though, is that it ignores the fact that not all women have access to the same choices. Socioeconomic status, income, education, upbringing, culture, religion, skin color, gender, all of these things affect and are affected by the kinds of choices that are available for any one of us to make at any given time. If we take the example of a single mom raising 2 kids without child support, what kind of choices are available to her? She may want to go back to school or open a business or compete in a soccer tournament or bake bread bread from scratch every morning, but she has 2 little mouths to feed all by herself. Or the recent trend of bimbofication, where overtly intelligent women intentionally present themselves as bimbos to challenge the idea that women who are conventionally attractive are also unintelligent.
I'm a Barbie girl in the Barbie world. Life in plastic, it's fantastic. You can brush my hair.
Editing Megan here, coming at you from my floor, and not gonna lie, the song in that video is absolutely fire, and I'm gonna go find it as soon as I'm done editing this, because who doesn't want a metal version of Barbie Girl? At first glance, this seems feminist as fuck, but when you peel back the layers of intersectionality and history and racism, it all falls apart. Just to give you an example, many of these new age self-styled bimbos are white women, and if Black or Asian women were to participate in this, it would have the opposite of its intended effect. That's because Black women and Asian women are already hypersexualized in our culture, and they suffer from disproportionate rates of sexual violence, and they're not socially and culturally protected in the same way as white women are. Bimbofication only works if you're a white woman, so claiming that this is an inherently feminist act ignores and excludes a huge proportion of women. The most insidious thing about choice feminism is that it justifies the exploitation of women's bodies and women's labor by framing this exploitation as being empowered individual choice. If a woman chooses to sell her body and monetize her sexuality, it's feminist because she's choosing it. But what if she's choosing it because she has no other means of making a living? What if she needs to pay off student loans and there's no work available that will pay her a living wage? If a woman chooses to stay at home and submit to her husband and dedicate her life to her kids, it's feminist because she's choosing it. But what if she grew up in a culture that rewards the women who make such choices and punishes the ones who don't with ostracization, stigmatization, and judgment? This is why choice feminism is inherently flawed. It assumes, like capitalism, that we all live in individual little bubbles, completely unaffected by our culture, society, and the people around us. It ignores the environments and social influences that shape and guide our choices, and it assumes that we're all starting off from a place of equality, which is just objectively untrue. The choices available to a wealthy, straight, cis white woman are going to be fundamentally different from those available to an immigrant woman or a poor woman or a woman of color or a trans woman. Claiming that it's feminist to make a choice, any choice at all, ignores the different realities that we all have to contend with and the different starting points that we're all coming from. And that brings us to Ballerina Farm. Who is Hannah Nealman? Hannah Nealman is, as I mentioned earlier, a 34-year-old Tradwife influencer and the creator of Ballerina Farm, a lifestyle brand that she built around her stay-at-home mom homesteading lifestyle in rural Utah. Her posts feature her performing a variety of domestic tasks in rustic settings, wearing prairie dresses and aprons, usually with a cacophony of kids in the background and a baby or two hanging off her. Her brand portrays a calm and wholesome rural lifestyle that glorifies traditional gender roles and romanticizes living off the land. Hannah and her 8 siblings come from relatively humble backgrounds, and they were raised in a middle-class Mormon household, and they were all homeschooled. She started dancing at the age of 9, and at 17 years old, she moved to New York City to attend Juilliard's prestigious undergraduate ballet program. She paid for her degree by competing in scholarship beauty pageants, and it was her dream to dance professionally. Megan Agnew, the Times reporter who interviewed Hannah for the article, asked her if homesteading was what she always wanted. We drive past the dairy cows, looking out across a river valley and the arid mountains beyond. Was this what she always wanted? I ask when we get a moment alone while Daniel checks on the animals. No, she says. I was like, she pauses. My goal was New York City. I left home at 17 and I was so excited to get there. I just loved that energy. And I was going to be a ballerina. I was a good ballerina. She pauses again. But I knew that when I started to have kids, my life would start to look different. Hannah met her husband Daniel at a college basketball game where they were introduced by a mutual friend. For Daniel, it was love, or more accurately, probably lust, at first sight, and he told Megan in their interview that he wanted to marry her right away. He was 23, and she was nearly 2 years his junior when they were introduced by a mutual friend at a college basketball game. I saw her and I was ready to go, he says. Sign me up. I was thinking let's get married, but she wouldn't go on a date with me for 6 months. Daniel's father is the owner and co-founder of a number of commercial airlines, including JetBlue, and is a billionaire. He also grew up in a Mormon family with 8 other siblings and had a privileged upbringing in Connecticut. Connecticut. When Megan asked him the same question she asked Hannah, if homesteading was what he always wanted, his answer was notably different from his wife's. Was this what he always wanted? I asked him when he walks back over. Yes, he says. I expected Hannah to be more at home with the kids, but she said, I watched my parents working together, and so whatever we do, we gotta do it together. Daniel obviously had a very clear idea of what he wanted his life to look like. Traditional marriage with traditional gender roles and lots of kids, living off the land and adhering to traditional Mormon standards and dictates. From the way the article is written, it seems like Daniel saw Hannah, thought to himself, that's the kind of wife I want, and then proceeded to make it happen. As the son of a billionaire with a privileged upbringing, he was probably used to getting what he wanted, so when Hannah didn't want to date him at first, he took it as a challenge. She mentioned to him one day that she was flying from Salt Lake City back to New York to resume her studies at Juilliard, not knowing that the airline she was flying on was owned by his dad. Daniel then proceeded to pull some strings and ended up sitting next to her on the flight, where they talked for 5 hours. After that, the two began dating, and Hannah was still putting on the brakes because she was in her last year at Juilliard and wanted to finish her degree. Back then, I thought we should date for a year before marriage, she continues, so I could finish school and whatever. And Daniel was like, it's not going to work, we've got to get married now. After a month, they were engaged. 2 months after that, they were married, moving into an apartment Daniel rented on the Upper West Side. And 3 months after that, she was pregnant, the first Juilliard undergraduate to be expecting in modern history. She danced professionally for a few years, and then eventually they settled down in Utah on their farm, and she had to give it up. Our first few years of marriage were really hard. We sacrificed a lot, she says, but we did have this vision, this dream, and Daniel interrupts. We still do. What kind of sacrifices? I ask her. Well, I gave up dance, which was hard. You give up a piece of yourself, and Daniel gave up his career ambitions. Megan Agnew then goes on to say the quiet part out loud, the part we're all thinking at this point. I look out at the vastness and don't totally agree. Daniel wanted to live in the great western wilds, so they did. He wanted to farm, so they do. He likes date nights once a week, so they go. They have a babysitter on those evenings. He didn't want nannies in the house, so there aren't any. The only space earmarked to be Nealman's own, a small barn she wanted to convert into a ballet studio, ended up becoming the kids' schoolroom. Though she had to give up her ballet career, Hannah still competes in pageants, and that's a large part of what earned her the fame or infamy, depending on your perspective. She was crowned Mrs. America in 2023 and was invited back to compete in Mrs. World the following year. She competed in a swimsuit and 5-inch heels 12 days after giving birth. I had known it was coming, says Nealman, 34, sitting in her kitchen in rural Utah, 2 of her children literally swinging off her long golden hair. So I had prepared. During the pregnancy, it took brute strength, guts, and bravery to make sure she could eventually look so perfectly pretty. She kept fit, weightlifting before her children woke up. She had ice baths, lowering herself into the irrigation ditches on the farm, and she took iron supplements to speed up the healing. Her daughter Flora was born at home without painkillers like all of her children except 2, and a week after the birth, she was up and doing bar exercises, trying on outfits by day 9, and on day 11 postpartum was on a flight to Las Vegas with her then less than 2 weeks old newborn in tow. Predictably, the internet lost its mind over this, with fierce debates flying back and forth over whether this was the ultimate act of empowerment or a flagrant show of oppression and enforced patriarchal beauty standards on her vulnerable postpartum body. Despite being the literal poster child of Tradwives, Hannah doesn't describe herself in those terms. When Megan asked her how she feels about being cast as one of the leaders of the Tradwife movement, she replied that she doesn't necessarily identify with it. Because we are traditional in the sense that it's a man and a woman, we have children, but I do feel like we're paving a lot of paths that haven't been paved before. That is the biggest paradox. In selling the life of a stay-at-home mother, Nealman and the other Tradwives have created high-earning jobs. They are being paid to act out a fantasy. So for me to have the label of a traditional woman, she continues cautiously, I'm kind of like, I don't know if I identify with that. In my video deep dive about Tradwives, I talked about the irony of these women promoting traditional gender roles online while making an independent living from content creation. At least we see here that Hannah is aware of this paradox, unlike other Tradwife influencers such as SDC Williams, who proudly calls herself a Tradwife and loudly advocates for men being the breadwinners to her monetized audience of over 120,000 followers.
Overall, transitioning from 2 incomes closer to 1 is a sacrifice. It's very well worth it. Traditional marriage is so rewarding. And yes, you're going to sacrifice things, and it's well worth it.
Hannah and David both have strongly held Mormon beliefs, so in that sense, she's very much aligned with many of the other Tradwife content creators online, like model and influencer Nara Smith, who's 22, always pregnant, makes chewing gum from scratch, and also has millions of TikTok followers.
My sister's in town to visit, and she's been craving bubblegum so bad, but she ran out, so I just decided to make it for her. My toddlers have been asking for marshmallows ever since we ran out, so today I decided to Surprised them by making them some salted caramel marshmallows. This morning I asked my toddlers what they wanted for breakfast and they both said cereal, so cereal it was and we got started right away.
Being Mormon or just conservatively Christian seems to be wildly common among Tradwives, and it makes sense. Being raised in an environment that strongly emphasizes traditional gender roles means that you'd be more likely to grow up and embrace those gender roles yourself someday. And this is where we come to the idea of choice. Choosing traditional gender roles. Mormons and other conservative Christians place a strong emphasis on traditional gender roles, as well as the family being the foundation of morality and faith. A key part of the Tradwife movement is submitting to one's husband, which content creators like SDC Williams emphatically encourage.
I submit and I serve my husband. This is a biblical thing, so don't twist this into something that it's not. It is a blessing to be my husband's helpmate, and the Bible has the man of the household, not the woman, so he leads.
Admittedly, and to her credit, Hannah Nealman insists that her husband is an equal partner in their marriage, even though all he does is the laundry and occasionally babysits his own children, but the patriarchal underpinnings are still there. In the Times article, Megan makes the point that David often talks over his wife and answers questions for her. He's the one who insists that Hannah gives birth at home without pain relief, and when Megan asked her about it, Hannah waited until David was out of earshot before admitting that once, when she gave birth at a hospital without her husband there, she'd asked for an epidural, and it was an amazing experience. David overall seemed reluctant to let the reporter be alone with Hannah or to let his wife speak for herself. I can't, it seems, get an answer out of Nealman without her being corrected, interrupted, or answered for by either her husband or a child. Usually, I am doing battle with steely Hollywood publicists. Today, I am up against an army of toddlers who all want their mom and a husband who thinks he knows better. This is a trend I've also noticed in the comment section of some of my videos where I talk about tradwives and pronatalism. Men will comment that their wives love staying at home, that they feel fulfilled in their roles as wives and mothers, and that they made the free and enthusiastic choice to do those things. And then when I reply that I'd love to hear directly from their wives instead of them about that, they lose their goddamn minds. You don't have to be religious to be a tradwife, but many of the most famous ones are. Nara Smith, as I mentioned earlier, is a devout Mormon, and Kelly Haven-Stickle is an evangelical Christian writer who posts homesteading content with a rustic Victorian aesthetic to her 56,000 Instagram followers, highlighting Bible verses in her captions.
An awareness of God's grace and favor. The world saw joy as a bubbly waterfall, but biblically, it was a calm delight.
A lot of tradwife influencers aren't as overt about their fundamentalist Christian beliefs, though. Their content is soothing, aspirational, aesthetically pleasing, and it offers a nice break from the hardships of life in our late-stage capitalist dystopian nightmare. Who wouldn't want to lose themselves in sunset photos of sunflower fields and pies cooling in ceramic dishes on cracked windowsills and beautiful women in prairie dresses swaddling perfect little infants? The milk and honey vibes of the internet's tradwives are designed to seem like a break from the stresses of modern life and to pull in young women without necessarily talking about how religion dictates and limits their lifestyles and gender roles. We live in chaotic and uncertain times, and when the world seems unstable and hard, people crave order and structure and rules. This is how fascism thrives and how Hitler rose to power in post-war 1930s era Germany, where everyone was suffering and starving under like sky-high inflation. The thing about living in uncertainty is that you have to make up your own way forward, and that can feel overwhelming and scary and absolutely impossible when it feels like everything's just falling apart around you. Because it is, and everything is falling apart around us. AI is stealing jobs, inflation is making it harder and harder to both feed yourself and keep a roof over your head. Climate change is killing people en masse, destroying communities and homes, and causing mass migrations already. We just lived through a historic global pandemic. We're teetering on the brink of another world war, and I don't want to fearmonger, but all of these things are the reality that we're living in, and we all know that on some level, even if most of the time we're able to dissociate from those things.
Megan, back at you again. I realized that last part got like a little dark, and I try really hard to not be doom and gloom on my channel. However, that is, as I said, the reality that we're living in. So I just want to be really clear about that, and I want to be always like realistic and truthful about the challenges that we're facing. It's always difficult to do that without sounding like, oh my God, society is ending. I really don't think that's the case. I think that it's just going to get harder and harder to live and to do things, which is all the more reason why we need to take action right now to make our lives better, to improve our society while we still can. So I will be talking about that later in this video, but I just wanted to pop in here and say, like, sorry for things getting a little bit dark just now. I promise that there is hope at the end of this video. It's not all doom and gloom. Just stick with it.
Under these conditions, going back to a world that's ordered by strict and predictable roles seems especially attractive, especially for young people who will live to see the breakdown of our ecosystems and the failure of many societies to adapt to that. Religious fundamentalism offers certainty and belonging, both of which are crucial to our well-being as humans, and they're especially attractive right now when neoliberal capitalism has stripped us of any kind of organic community or social ties. Dr. Laura Anderson, a therapist who helps people deconstructing religion and who herself left a fundamentalist community, points out that fundamentalism is a coping mechanism for a deregulated nervous system, but what's underneath the photos of Tradwife influencers is not reality. Christian influencers are nothing new, and televangelists have existed for decades now, but what's new is the internet and the sheer volume of content that's available for consumption. Social media algorithms are designed to serve content that's tailored to each user's consumption habits, so it's easy to fall down a rabbit hole of fundamentalist content which keeps regenerating itself over and over again. It used to be that if you were a religious person, you might get all your Christian content from church on Sundays, with the occasional TV show or radio program to sustain you throughout the week. Now it's 24/7, and by the time a Christian gets to church on Sunday morning, they would have likely already devoured hundreds of hours of Instagram posts, TikToks, YouTube videos, podcasts, and Fox News, all with a far-right fundamentalist bent. Currently, more than 40% of self-described evangelicals don't go to church at all, relying totally on the internet and this type of content to help them build their spiritual lives. Tradwives are the propagandists of this system, offering traditional guidance on parenting, sexuality, femininity, housekeeping, and how to be more attractive to men in the absence of more realistic, more present, and more embodied communities. Their content sucks you in because it offers easy answers. Just follow these steps and you'll be okay. Purity culture and dating app fatigue. Despite being framed as wholesome, Tradwife content like that of Ballerina Farm is very heterosexual and very focused on romantic relationships. It promotes purity culture, which is a fundamentalist Christian doctrine that reinforces chastity and abstinence until marriage. It's really destructive because it reinforces rigid gender roles and toxic masculinity, holding women responsible when men lust after them. A lot of the criticism of purity culture focuses on how it's about controlling women's bodies and priming girls and young women to think of themselves as property, first of their fathers and then of their husbands. And this is definitely a huge problem, and all the criticisms are valid and important. Something that's rarely touched on, though, is how insidious these messages actually are on a psychological and emotional level. Inherent in purity culture is a promise to young people, especially young women, that if they toe the line and follow the strict rules that are being modeled for them by Christian fundamentalist influencers, they'll be rewarded with true love, a beautiful family, and lots of hot sex with a man who won't leave them and will be bound to them forever by marriage. It plays into the Disney princess fantasies that we all grew up with, and it's especially attractive in a world where romantic relationships, like everything else, are precarious and uncertain. A recent Forbes survey from this past month shows that over half of participants on popular dating apps like Bumble and Tinder reported finding a long-term committed relationship as their goal for being on the apps. The numbers for Gen Z skewed even slightly higher than millennials and Gen Xers, coming in at 52% of app users actively looking for a long-term partner. Just to contrast, millennials scored 49% and Gen X scored 47% in case you're interested, but I'll leave the link to the survey below so that you can see more of that yourself. A whopping 78% of users reported feeling worn out from using the apps, and younger generations are the ones experiencing dating app burnout the most, with millennials coming in at 80% and Gen Z close behind us at 79%. I'm chalking that 1% discrepancy up to the youngins perhaps still having some smidgen of energy and hope for the future, whereas my generation is just completely exhausted, like 80% exhausted. All of this to say, swiping through apps trying to find your person is physically, mentally, and emotionally draining, and it can feel similar to the absolutely soul-sucking process of applying for a job. If young people are finding themselves constantly having to do both of those things over and over again, often at the same time, it's no wonder that Instagram photos of models churning butter in a rustic kitchen kitchen somewhere in Montana while their 8 rosy-cheeked blonde children hang from their prairie dress skirts feels aspirational. Who wouldn't want to throw in the towel and jam their feet into some cowboy boots and pop out a few kids instead, especially if the price of entry is relatively low? As James Bryant of Fundy Fridays here on the YouTube said, there's a low point of entry to the Christian influencer world. As long as you're like, I'm saved, I found Jesus, you're going to get people who mindlessly agree with that to follow you. Fundamentalist Christianity promises big rewards in exchange for your obedience and bodily autonomy. For the low price of your independence and freedom, you can get yourself a spouse who doesn't believe in divorce and will never leave you, a community that will rally around you through the good and the bad, a permanent break from the rat race, and the social status and dignity that comes from reaching all those adult milestones actually on time. It's tempting, I'm not gonna lie. When times are uncertain, when life is hard, we want certainty and security. That's human nature. It's a fundamental biological drive that we all have, and it's very, very hard to ignore. When someone is promising to fulfill those needs and you agree to their conditions for doing so, are you really agreeing freely though? What kind of choice is it when your options are depression, anxiety, stress, and burnout on the one hand, or depression, anxiety, stress, and burnout, but with dignity and a permanent life partner on the other hand? This is why I have such a problem with tradwives on the internet and people in my comment section saying that the women who end up succumbing to these lifestyles are freely and authentically choosing them. I'm sure some are, but I'm also sure that the majority aren't.
Editing Megan back for hopefully the last time. Obviously, that was not a factual statement. It was completely anecdotal, taken straight from my butt, so take it with a grain of salt. I have no data to back that up. Just FYI.
How feminist of a choice are you really making when you're making it under duress? In the Times expose of Ballerina Farm, Megan Agnew made the point that Hannah was plucked out of her intended life and career path and sidelined into marriage by the persuasion and honestly low-key stalking of her husband. She expressed over and over again that she didn't want to date him, didn't want to get married right away, and didn't want to have kids until she'd had a chance to fulfill her career ambitions. And yet somehow none of those things happened. Somehow she still found herself pregnant at Juilliard, married at 23, and packed away to rural Utah just a few short years later. And now in her mid-30s, she's not even allowed to speak to a journalist without being interrupted by her husband. To what extent did she choose this? How informed was she about the repercussions of this choice before she actually made it? When you grow up in a culture that overemphasizes romance and heterosexuality, you're conditioned to want it, especially if you're assigned female at birth. Think about all the movies and TV shows and books that we grew up with that featured heterosexual romance as a central theme and the desired outcome. Even overtly feminist books that were written for young girls in the late 90s, like Ella Enchanted and the Gemma Doyle trilogy, still featured heterosexual romance as key parts of the plot. It was really hard to escape compulsory heterosexuality, even in feminist spaces, and that's why a lot of women don't realize they're queer until later in life, because it takes a long time and a lot of intentionality to deconstruct those messages and figure out how you actually feel and what you authentically want. Why choice feminism is a problem and why tradwives are dangerous. The reality is that it's nearly impossible to make an authentically free choice in a society that's heavily influenced by patriarchy, heterosexuality, racism, and capitalism. On the surface, women are free to choose how we want to dress and present ourselves, but we do so under the heavy scrutiny of those around us who will judge and possibly punish us no matter what we do. I recently chose to stop shaving some of my body hair, and obviously half my head is shaved, I have a lot of tattoos, and I frequently choose to mix up masculine and feminine clothing when getting dressed, but I'm acutely aware of the fact that being able to choose those things at all is a privilege because I'm a white cis woman who hasn't been masculinized her whole life and who doesn't have to work really hard to prove her gender. Choice feminism ignores intersectionality, and that's one of the main problems with it. Are Black women really free to make empowered choices about how to style their hair in a fundamentally racist society that looks down on them for wearing it naturally? A survey from 2023 found that Black women in America spend on average 4 times more on their hair every month than white women do, and they spend nearly 2 hours more at the salon each time they visit. Are they really freely choosing to invest that kind of time and money when doing so might give them better job prospects or social standing? That's some pretty powerful incentive to do that. Are working class women really free to choose a career when they're living paycheck to paycheck and just need a job? Are young women who date men really free to choose to be stay-at-home mothers when they can't find suitable life partners because more and more men are being radicalized online? What are their choices then? Give up on a dream or become radicalized themselves? Are women who grew up in conservative communities really freely making the choice to be housewives when everything they were raised to believe is priming them for that role, and they risk losing their communities and social standing if they dare to choose differently? Choice feminism is an illusion, and it's a dangerous one. It reinforces the neoliberal obsession with individuality and individual responsibility, and it ignores the powerful and coercive forces of religion, upbringing, society, and the economy. Ironically, by pushing back against the neoliberal capitalist systems that these tradwives claim to hate, they're simultaneously benefiting from them and perpetuating them by reinforcing this fantastical idea of free and independent choice as a feminist act. Tradwives themselves are dangerous because they radicalize young women by exploiting their very valid fears of the future and draw them into white nationalist, Christian fundamentalist, and fascist ideologies.
It is clear that society wants to separate young influential people from their family, from their structure, for them to get an education. I want to say I'm not telling anybody how to live. This is just food for thought, and I promote my lifestyle. I promote traditional marriage, and I wanted to put this out there because it's been weighing on me.
As Ryan Coogan, a reporter for The Independent, put it, on top of the sexism inherent with a lifestyle brand that tells women to stay in the kitchen, many tradwife influencers also engage in troubling anti-LGBT plus rhetoric designed as pro-family values, racism designed as a return to community, and bizarre conspiracy theories designed as all-natural independent living. Viewers are often encouraged to homeschool their children, live off the grid, not take vaccines, not trust the government, not trust doctors, give birth in their bedrooms, and vote for cranks. The meteoric rise of homeschooling and radical unschooling among tradwives and stay-at-home moms is troubling because it means that an entire generation is growing up without any kind of standardized education. One of my favorite YouTubers, The Queer Kiwi, recently did a video about the radical unschooling movement, which was both hilarious and terrifying, and I'll link to it below so you can check it out yourself. But my point is, what happens to society when we have a huge cohort of kids growing up not knowing how to read or write, who severely lack social skills and who are unvaccinated? Vintage-sounding diseases like polio, measles, mumps, and rubella are already making a comeback because unvaccinated kids are allowing these pathogens to get a toehold into the human population once again. It's really ironic that far-right pundits scream about the end of civilization due to low birth rates 1 second, and then go on to advocate for ideologies that would have us all be sicker and less educated. What will happen to civilization when no one can read and write anymore and we're all stuck inside again because there's a very preventable and unnecessary pandemic of measles going around? Tradwives criticize feminists for forcing women to work outside the home and participate in the capitalist rat race, but this ignores the fact that when mid-century feminists pushed for equal rights in the workplace was much more friendly to all kinds of workers. Wages were higher, the cost of living was lower, jobs were easier to find and more secure once you found one, and most people expected to work the same job at the same company until they retired. The workplace that the 1960s and 70s era feminists were pushing to join was a very different one from the workplace that currently exists, and that's not because of feminism. Reagan, Thatcher, Mulrooney era neoliberalism in the 1980s and 90s screwed workers over by deregulating the economy and shipping jobs overseas, which led to the late-stage capitalist hellscape that we're all struggling to survive in today. It's not the fault of feminists that work is so soul-crushing. It's the fault of big tech companies and billionaires who've been buying out politicians for the past 40 years, and I could and probably will at some point do an entire video essay just on that. But my point right now is that tradwives blaming modern feminists for all of this is a handy straw man argument that serves as a handy dog whistle for modestly educated women who are terrified of not being able to keep body and soul together without also trashing their mental and physical health in the process. Tradwife content endangers the possibility of any kind of meaningful action to actually address the things that make our future feel so scary by telling us to just get married and have babies and leave the real problems to the menfolk. To which all I have to say is, I echo the sentiments of Marina when she sang that song about not wanting to live in a man's world anymore. And these tradwives aren't just dangerous to society as a whole. Conforming to strict gender roles under pressured motivation, as opposed to autonomous motivation, creates a psychological burden that compromises individual well-being and self-esteem. Tradwife content has been shown to instigate pressured motivation, which obscures authentic desire. In other words, it perpetuates compulsory heterosexuality, which makes it really, really hard for each individual woman consuming this content to actually get in touch with her authentic desires and gender expression so that she can make a free choice. It's dangerous for society and it's unhealthy for individuals. So, how can we meaningfully address the fears that tradwives exploit? The average tradwife on social media will tell us that all we have to do to live a good life free from worry and hardship is to get married and adhere to traditional gender roles. But as we've just examined over the course of this video essay, clearly that's not true. So what are some things we can do instead to actually address the really scary problems that make life feel so heavy and impossible right now? Well, here are just some ideas for the more motivated among us. Number 1, advocate for a universal basic income. I touched on this already in my longer and much more involved video about tradwives, which I will link to below, but the Coles Notes version is that UBI has been proven to work. It has a track record of lifting entire communities out of poverty, increasing post-secondary education attendance, and it's been positively correlated with a robust job market. And all of that aside, it's just humane. Just let people have food, let people have shelter. These are basic human rights and basic human needs that are meant to be provided for us by our planet that we shouldn't have to ever worry about and that shouldn't ever become instruments of capitalist gain. Number 2, advocate for universal healthcare in places that don't already have it. I'm looking at you, America. And keep pushing for better and higher quality healthcare in places that do. When everyone can access medical treatment and drugs and surgeries whenever they need to, we'll have a happier and healthier population that will, surprise, surprise, be better able to work and do a good job at work. Number 3, advocate for better support for families. A huge talking point of these far-right pundits is that birth rates are falling, which will result in the crumbling of civilization eventually. Even if that was true, providing better support for new mothers and families like free childcare, tax breaks, and universal access to family planning, birth control, gun control, and abortion would encourage more people to have families when and only when they're ready for them and authentically want them, which means more children will be born to more parents who are actually willing and able to take care of them and raise them well, which all of us will collectively benefit from. Pressure your representatives to take more action on climate change. Put pressure on them to prioritize spending money on things like building walkable communities, expanding and updating public transit systems, improving the infrastructure for electric cars, and switching to sustainable energy. Number 5, pressure your representatives to incentivize companies to improve their hiring practices and treatment of workers. With the rise of AI, it's more important than ever to make sure we're regulating the job market so that workers are given a fair shot and treated well and paid a living wage. And if we can't do that, then see my point above about universal basic income. Number 6, push for better mental health care. All of us should be going for mental health checkups and screenings once a year, the same as we'd visit the dentist for a cleaning and the doctor for a physical. The fact that mental health has been systematically ignored for such a long time plays a huge role in why so many of us struggle, and if we were to start treating it as a society the same way we treat our physical health, we'd all be a lot better off. Things are getting better. It's no longer stigmatized to talk about your mental health or to see a therapist, and many companies do offer mental health days the same as they offer sick days, but public policy needs to catch up. Advocating for universal coverage for mental health would go a long way to helping all of us build better communities and cope better with the stresses of life without falling into radical right-wing rabbit holes. Learn about what feminism is and what it isn't. That's what I've been trying desperately to do on this channel, providing education about intersectional feminism and why it's so important. I'm not exaggerating or being melodramatic when I say that women, both cis and trans, are under attack right now, and none of us are free until all of us are free. It's so important to understand that proximity to power does not equal power, and that all women are in danger in a patriarchal society regardless of their status. If The Handmaid's Tale taught us anything, it's that. I tried. Which, by the way, stay tuned because I have a deep dive video essay coming up in the next few weeks about internalized misogyny in The Handmaid's Tale, and I'm super excited. I just recently finished watching it. I know, I'm late to the party, but word on the street is that there's a 6th season coming out sometime next year, so I thought now would be a good time to revisit the previous 5 seasons, but I digress. That will be a thing later. None of these things are as glamorous or as aesthetically pleasing as Ballerina Farm's Milk and Honey Instagram feed, but they're much more effective and will go a lot farther in actually addressing and resolving a lot of the fears that her and other tradwives both knowingly and unknowingly exploit. So what happens to Ballerina Farm now? Despite the fact that the Times article painted an unsettling portrait of Hannah Nealman's life, suggesting that she unhappily gave up her career ambitions and the life she'd always dreamed about to serve her 8 kids and a controlling husband, Hannah herself seems remarkably unbothered by it all. 2 days ago on Instagram, she posted a video that featured her and her husband and their new baby in a sprawling field promoting their new dairy products.
When we started to farm, I was swept up in the beauty of learning to make food from scratch. It makes sense why I soon fell in love with the idea of a family milk cow. I was making my own butter, cheese, ice cream, and yogurt. As I began to explore this world, to cook and invent, I needed a way to share these products with more than just friends and family. I needed a dairy. So 2 years of planning, and then an additional 2 years of construction, and we finally did it. And soon we'll be sharing these products with all of you. So for date night tonight, Daniel and I snuck over to the dairy. The temperature was perfect, little Flora Joe was giggling, and the cows were gorgeous. It's the world we created, and I couldn't love it more.
There's a flurry of comments under the video telling her to run and that she deserves better. Just as loud, though, are the comments supporting her and celebrating her choice to live this life. And I suspect I'll probably get a few similar comments on this video as well, as I always do when I talk about tradwives and pronatalism and compulsory heterosexuality. These things are real and they're insidious, and they affect each one of us whether we know it or not. It's not easy to deconstruct them, and if you're watching this and have made it this far, then congratulations, because you're already in that process. You wouldn't be here if you weren't. Hannah's carefully crafted image of rural domestic bliss has its cracks, though. Shortly after the Times article was published, a video resurfaced on TikTok showing Hannah opening a birthday present from her husband. In the video, she expressed a wish for tickets to Greece. Keep in mind that his father is a billionaire who owns an airline, but received an egg apron instead.
Okay, it was my birthday present from Daniel. Hoping their tickets to Greece.
Where's it from?
I don't know, the boys took it off.
I took it off.
It's from Ukraine.
So, plane tickets? Ooh, a hat I can wear in Greece.
It's not a hat.
It's not.
Oh, my egg apron!
Eggs in it.
It's great. They can gather eggs.
So cute. It's really cute. It's a cute one.
That's the best. You're welcome.
Thanks, honey.
Not for a long time.
The video has since been deleted, but its existence at all begs the following questions. How much does Hannah's husband actually respect and honor her choices? And how much of a choice could she have felt she had to marry him in the first place when everything he did was carefully calculated to coerce her into his idea of domestic bliss? And if it can happen to Hannah, who else can it and does it happen to? That's going to do it, my loves. I'm sorry this one ended up being a little bit more ranty than usual. I guess I'm just feeling extra spicy today. And besides that, you all know how I feel about tradwife stuff. Doth she protest too much? Maybe. I too would love nothing more than to bake pies all day long and arrange flowers, and I am very aware of that desire in me. However, I am not willing to trade my agency or my autonomy in order to do those things. And if I was, I'd still be married, and I'd be just as stressed out as I am now, only the stress would be about different things. No less, just different. At least now I can enjoy my anxiety on my own terms. Thanks for watching this all the way through, and thanks for all your support of my channel. As of filming this video, I've just passed 2,500 subscribers, and I'm growing every day, and I appreciate your support so much. I'm passionate about education around LGBTQIA+ issues, feminism, history, and fashion, and how all of those things come together and intersect. And I want to keep bringing you informational video essays about all of the above, so definitely stick around if that's your jam and you want to hear more of me ranting about all this stuff. I hope you're all having a wonderful day wherever you are, whatever you're doing, and I'll see you all in the next one. Toodaloo!
Thank you.